everybody. Thanks so much for coming out today for our Sunday Salon. We are so excited to have Zak Breckenridge here to talk about Rachel Carson. Before I introduce Zak, I just want to mention a couple upcoming events just to put on your radar. One is for the younger friends in your life. If you know any young readers, we're thinking like ages 5 to 10 or so. We're doing a really big summer reading club kind of program for that age group this summer. Everyone's come in and gotten a free book and a packet, and on July 30th, open to anybody, even if they're 5 to 10 year olds, even if they're not already part of the program. We're going to do a kind of like midsummer literary social for kids. So that's Thursday, July 30th at 4 o'clock. Should be really fun. So tell the little ones that you know. Then on Tuesday, August 4th, we're having the now 4th installment of our readings at Snowfort. And this time it's focused on writers who are using personal experience and material for their writing. We have one poet and two nonfiction writers. Chelsea Dodd, who became acquainted with Snowfort when she had a residency at Craigarden last summer, is coming to read from her new poetry chapbook. Lauren McGovern, who is local and writes nonfiction, and Joan Lilly, who some of you might know, who is coming to us from Wadhams, all the way from Wadhams, and whose chapbook, Hair in Several Parts, we are actually publishing as Publishing Genius, and we'll be releasing the chapbook that evening. So that's Tuesday, August 4th at 6 o'clock. We're really excited for that reading and to celebrate Joan's work. Zak Breckenridge grew up in Essex. Some of you might know his family. And is now a teacher, scholar, and writer based in Long Beach, California. He's a doctoral candidate in English at the University of Southern California, where he researches the intertwined histories of ecological science, literary experimentation, and environmental consciousness. During the 2024-2025 academic year, he was a research fellow at Yale University's Beinecke Library, which holds the largest collection of archival materials related to Rachel Carson's life and work, and where he just organized a symposium on Rachel Carson last month. His writing has appeared in Western American literature, public books, and Edge Effects. He's also the host and producer of the podcast Erratics, which examines the future of higher education through conversations about the recently shuttered Bard College at Simon's Rock. So we're going to hear from Zak, and we'll have some time for questions, and then some time for more casual mingling. We have a tip jar, which all goes to our visiting guest, and so feel free to, make a contribution, travel money, that kind of thing. That's always much appreciated. We hope one day to have Zak's book for sale, but you're working on it, but that's not here yet. So for now, we've got the tip jar, and of course we've got coffee, and you're also welcome to browse books, but we'll have a Q&A first, and now we'll hear from Zak. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy and Adam, for having me. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to my family for helping set this up and for being here as well. And my plan is I'm setting a stopwatch. I'm planning to talk for about half an hour, and then we'll have sort of time for discussion and conversation. Who here is already familiar with Rachel Carson? Does anyone want to take a stab at who is Rachel Carson? What is your sort of baseline knowledge about her?
82.
DDT. She's associated with DDT, something to do with DDT, something to do with Silent Spring. So she wrote a book that was an impactful book, important in the environmental movement, maybe. Okay, that's great. That's perfect. And so yeah, Amy said a lot of this already, but I grew up around here. I live in the LA area. I'm finishing up my doctorate in English. I've been working on the history of modern environmentalist literature, and Rachel Carson has kind of become like the central figure in my research over the last couple of years. And in environmental writing, Rachel Carson is kind of both a major figure and a minor figure, which is to say that she has this monumental status as the author of Silent Spring, which came out in 1962, and it alerted the public to the dangers of synthetic pesticides, the most famous of which is DDT. And she, I think further than that, she's sort of associated with popularizing the idea of ecology in general, that was sort of not a household term before 1962, and after her, she kind of, with Silent Spring, she's warning about pesticides. She's also kind of educating her readers into thinking ecologically, thinking about these interconnections. And what's difficult about her legacy and thinking about her as a literary critic and scholar is that she's one of these rare writers who has had a material impact on the world. And so her name appears often in popular and academic writing about environmental issues, but it's often as a passing reference. It's often a sentence or two that's kind of using her to situate whatever we're actually talking about in history in relation to maybe Silent Spring. And actually relatively little, I mean, there is people who work on Carson, but there's relatively little that's specifically about her. And definitely in my home discipline of literary studies, she hasn't received the meticulous attention that a writer like William Faulkner or Virginia Woolf gets, who are, you know, she's a modern writer. She's contemporary with the modernist movement and some of these folks who are more associated with literature, but she's often not read as a literary writer in this way, right? That is kind of the point that I'm making. And I've been actively revising my dissertation chapter about Rachel Carson this week, so I'm really curious to hear what you all think and hear your thoughts. I think this idea that really gets associated with her is that ecology means the natural world is unified, orderly, and balanced. And the kind of corollary of this is human activity has the capacity to disrupt this orderly and balanced world. And a lot of what I've been trying to do in my work is use archival materials and minor texts, and especially the work of like historians of science and some other environmental historians to peek under the hood of this idea of ecological unity. Because I think it's very familiar to us, but for Carson and her contemporaries, these were new ideas. And it was this sort of exploratory space, both scientifically, but I think also imaginatively and literarily. So ecology was an emergent, young subfield of biology at this time. And the signs of mass environmental degradation were becoming much more apparent. We can think of the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression, which takes place really right when Carson is like graduating from college. And going into graduate school, the end of the 1920s, the beginning of the 1930s. She's born in, I believe, 1907. So she's really associated with the 60s moment, but she's really a product of the Great Depression, and she's really a sort of like 1950s American middle class intellectual figure. And she did not live long enough to see a lot of the effects of Silent Spring in the way that it was taken up. So I think that looking at her in this way, maybe really trying to place her in history, especially the history of science, kind of gives us a richer, more subtle toolkit to think about who she was and what the significance of her work was. but also to evaluate her relevance to our own moment of global ecological catastrophe, which I think the sort of most obvious evidence of it that we can see lately is the smoke from the wildfires that have been blowing in here, which is, this is kind of an aside, but I don't always use the language of climate change because that can kind of that's the sort of most macro scale to look at our own moment of environmental crises. But even if there wasn't climate change, we would have issues with biodiversity loss and habitat loss and ocean acidification and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So climate change is really only the most zoomed out way of sort of framing the crisis that we're in. I called the talk Rachel Carson, writer, scientist, philosopher, because I wanted to suggest that this is a helpful way to kind of unbundle this saintly narrative that has grown up around Rachel Carson, to sort of break it up into different pieces to look at the different facets of the work that she did. So let's start with her as a scientist. And I only have a couple of slides. We'll get to them in a second. But she, as a child, she spent a lot of time in the woods and in the fields around her family's home in Pittsburgh. And she grew up in the 1910s and 1920s during the height of what was called the nature study movement. And her mother was a lot of the person who was educating her the most, and it was this idea that children can go out into the natural world, observe it for themselves, and sort of start. It's almost like a kind of early version of like how we think of liberal arts education or something like that, that they could go and observe it for themselves and solve their own problems and learn about the natural world by just asking the questions that they were asking. And so this was definitely in the air, and it was in the culture at the time that she was growing up. And when she went to college in the 1920s, she was an English major, but she had this brilliant biology teacher, Mary Scott Skinker, and she switched to be a biology major, but I believe she switched in her senior year. So she really thought she was going to be an English major, and she graduated. I think this was really unusual for a woman in her time. She went to pursue graduate work at Johns Hopkins, which, this is maybe not the place to talk about the history of Johns Hopkins, but it was founded at the end of the 19th century specifically as a professional research institution. And so this was really a home of like cutting edge, modern biological research. And she wrote her master's thesis on the embryonic development of the urinary system of a catfish. She really struggled with her master's, which she was dissecting catfish embryos at various stages of development to try to understand this particular organ and the way that it developed. And she started work towards a PhD, but she dropped out after, I think, one semester of after her master's. And it's not entirely clear to me why she leaves graduate school. I think a big part of it is her family's financial situation, right? Like, this is the moment of the Great Depression. I think probably it was a tough world to be a young woman at Johns Hopkins in zoology. And the letters of reference that like her professors there wrote her are sort of lukewarm. You know, they say she works hard, but she's not really brilliant. So she's not really a standout student to her professors at this time. But I also sort of suspect that maybe laboratory work wasn't really, like, didn't work that well for her, because what she really was passionate about was field work. And that's what she was able to do a little bit later on. But I don't think that was very respectable at the time at Johns Hopkins in this very professional environment. There was really a move to establish biology as a rigorous professional field, and the setting that they thought that could happen in was the laboratory. There's this quote from her that I like, which I actually didn't put up on a slide, but she said, she reflected later, "I had given up writing forever, I thought. It never occurred to me that I was merely getting something to write about." So we'll talk a little bit about her as a writer in a second. She graduates into the depths of the Great Depression, and she teaches a little bit, she works as a laboratory assistant, but eventually she gets part-time work for what was then the Bureau of Fisheries. and she's writing radio scripts and brochures for them there. And eventually she gets a full-time job, and she becomes an editor and communicator and writer for the Bureau of Fisheries, which then in 1939 gets folded into the Fish and Wildlife Service. And by the time she left her government job, her second book, The Sea Around Us, allows her to leave her job, and she's a full-time writer. But she was the head editor for all of the publications that the Fish and Wildlife Service was putting out. And so she's not doing a lot of like lab work, writing up primary research, but she is this like convergence point for all of this federal government research that's happening around this time. And all of her books draw from especially these networks that she has in government conservation and in the academic science world. Especially ecology, there's early ecological work is happening at this time in the Fish and Wildlife Service. And then for her second book, The Sea Around Us, which sort of makes her this literary celebrity, she is drawing on all of this new oceanographic research that is coming out of the Second World War. That she had sort of front row seats to these new developments. And so this is kind of my suspicion, is that she struggled in the laboratory setting where she had to become an expert in a single narrow phase of one species life cycle. And what she was really good at was educating herself in various scientific fields and integrating them into a sort of wider picture of the natural world. And that's what you see over and over in her writing. Okay, think of her as a writer. Her work always sits at the intersection of science and literature. She was obsessed with her cats as well. There's other things to say about her cats, but she has this meticulous attention to scientific precision, but she also has this meticulous attention to language on the level of diction, on the level of syntax, on the level of rhythm. And so her mom was her typist, and they would read the drafts out loud to each other until they sounded right. And the symposium at Yale I participated in. I did not put it together, but people were really interested in this, which is something from her her notes for Under the Sea Wind, which is her first book. This is a first edition copy. I'm happy to sort of pass these things around as we get further into it. But you can see that she's written scintillate, flash, glitter, gleam, glint, glimmer, shimmer, and she's written out definitions next to these words so that she can get exactly the right word. I think she's thinking about mackerel swimming, right? And trying to think about what are the distinctions between each of these specific verbs. So incredibly meticulous and a slow writer. That actually maybe will come up later. It took her a really long time to write the things that she wrote. And she also had persistent sort of health issues and other issues in her life. But okay, but thinking about her as a writer, me as a literary critic, I've really become interested in this first book, Under the Sea Wind, which she wrote while she was writing it at night while she was working for the government, and it was published in 1941. And if any of you have read any of her other books, it's a familiar blend of scientific and linguistic precision, but what makes it different is that it's essentially a novel. And it's written from the perspectives of various wild animals. That some of them have names, but she tries to anthropomorphize them as little as possible. And so, to my mind, this is like a sort of experimental, adventurous work in a way that her other stuff is mostly written in this kind of expository third person. This is really, it's free and direct discourse. It's this kind of novelistic technique that you find in 19th century social novels, but all the characters are fish and birds and crabs. So it's a little bit like a David Attenborough documentary, right? If it was written out. But I think it's important to keep in mind there were no David Attenborough documentaries in the late 30s, early 1940s. Very few people had been under the surface of the ocean. And she went beneath the surface of the ocean one time, and I don't think she got very much out of it. So it's sort of important to keep in mind it's this combination of her voraciously reading scientific reports and biological research and imagining her way into the lives and experiences of these creatures she writes about. So the stories are all stories of migration, predation, reproduction, and they stretch from inland ponds to the Sargasso Sea, from the shores of North Carolina to the Arctic tundra, and it's divided into 3 sections, each of which kind of follows a single creature's migration, but it dips into, the experience and the life cycle of various creatures that they encounter along the way. The animal protagonists, some of them have names like Rinchops or Anguilla, which are based on the Latin names of their species. And I guess I kind of said this, but like unlike much nature writing, there isn't a first-person human narrator who's going out into the natural world and having these sort of experiences of revelation or something like that. It's all written in the third person, and it's all about these wild creatures. Yeah, so this is another thing that she says about it. This is in a memo to the publisher's marketing department. I wanted my readers to feel that they were, for a time, actually living the lives of sea creatures. To bring this about, I had to forget a lot of human conceptions. She goes on to say, time measured by the clock means nothing to a mackerel or a seagull. There's a lot that I can say about this book, so I'll try to keep it to some key points. One of them is it has this vision of the natural world that kind of becomes difficult to maintain after Silent Spring, and even more difficult in our own moment of climate change, which is to say that nature in Under the Sea Wind is kind of untouchable, autonomous, and the rhythms of seasonal change are eternal and stable and therefore reassuring. And so this is something that she says elsewhere later in this essay about wonder from 1956. But she says, there is symbolic as well as actual beauty in the migration of birds, the ebb and flow of the tides, the folded bud ready for spring. There is something infinitely healing in the repeated refrains of nature, the assurance that dawn comes after night and spring after winter. And I'm going to discuss this a little bit more in more detail in a moment. But near the end of her life, Carson becomes really concerned that this, can no longer really be true, because she's coming to recognize humans' capacity to change, to disrupt the cellular and genetic structure of living creatures, as well as now we're seeing, that ocean currents can be disrupted and atmospheric currents can be disrupted. And so this kind of view of the natural world as this reassuring refuge from the concerns of our everyday life gets harder and harder to maintain, sort of as ecological knowledge and environmental degradation proceed and accelerate, in the time after she wrote this. So even though there is this, we might say, like, outdated theory of nature embedded in the book, there is something that she does, there's some things she does in this book that I haven't really seen other writers do, and that I do think sort of anticipate some of the concerns that we are wrestling with now in the time of climate change. And the first is that it displaces humans from the center of narrative attention. There are humans in the book. So these animals are not living in some Edenic, unspoiled past. They come across fishermen. They come across trash, which sometimes, poses a danger and sometimes doesn't. But the fishermen in the novel have about the same degree of subjective depth as the mackerel and the fish and the birds and the other characters that we encounter. And so the book has this ecological vision that places humans within the world rather than placing them outside of it or above it. And so this is an image that I got from Wikipedia of the great chain of being, which is this sort of, Enlightenment era Christian idea that at the top you have God, and then you have the angels, and then you have the humans, and so everything is sort of organized into this quite tight hierarchy. This is not, there's this sort of academic theoretical term that I think describes what she's doing, which is a flat ontology, which is to say the things that exist, the things that aren't organized into a clean hierarchy like this. There's a kind of equality or flatness on the level of being. And so at the same time, she refrains from giving the book an explicit conservationist or environmentalist message. So she's portraying wild animals as these kind of unique, autonomous creatures. Maybe they don't possess thought, but they certainly they possess experience and action or agency. They're not automatons. And I think I found evidence that there are instances where she'll use a metaphor that's like a little bit too human or a little bit too flowery, and she'll cut that out. Or there are also digressions where she'll say there was such and such history of, this animal got overpopulated and there was this attempt to conserve or hunt it down. She cuts that stuff too. So she's really trying to keep the narrative perspective focused on like what would a wild animal know. And then the thing that I think is really important about this book, maybe even more so than the decentering of humans, is using migration as the organizational principle. I've been reading some stuff that there are other kind of contemporary animal narratives that are structured like a biography. So it begins with like, there's this book, Tarka the Otter, that really influenced her, by a British writer, Henry Williamson. And Tarka, it begins with Tarka's birth, it ends with Tarka's death. So it's this sort of biography of a wild animal. And she's definitely learning from that, but actually the book is broken into 3 sections, each of which traces a migration. It's not necessarily a full life cycle. And so using migration as this sort of narrative organizational principle allows her to weave together all the lives of these various creatures that encounter one another along the way. And what seems important about this for me as well is it's not a book about place. It's a book about all of these complex ways that different organisms' lives are entangled, and different places, different regions are connected to one another. So you have a narrative that's organized around animals crossing boundaries and traveling. And so this kind of speaks to something that theorists of representation and narrative in the time of climate change are thinking about, which is we need to be thinking more creatively in terms of scale. That climate change poses this problem of that we can no longer think on just the scale of a human life or decades. And so she's sort of looking for this wider perspective. Okay, the last part is to talk about her as a philosopher. And this is not usually a term that people apply to her, but I suppose a premise of my work is that we can take her seriously as a thinker, not just as a scientist and a stylist. And I think she was a theorist of problems that were not just scientific, but imaginative and narrative as well. And so I think that if we pay really close attention to the substance and form of her writing in light of its historical context, we can get a sort of richer understanding of the problems she was thinking about and how she was approaching them. I've already been laying out some of the insights from Under the Sea Wind. So the sort of displacement of the human from the center of meaning or significance, the complexity of scale, and ecological interconnection. So she's not striving to... there's all these things where she's really meticulous about getting the exact development of a creature right, or the height of a pine right. But it's not for its own sake. It's because she's interested in how do we imagine and come to represent this impersonal, autonomous, ecologically interconnected world. And one of the things that has come to really interest me is there were some writing projects that she left unfinished at the end of her life. She died of cancer within 2 years of Silent Spring's publication. And she insisted that she had stuff that she was planning to write. She was kind of in denial about how close to the end she was, actually. And there's one book that was about wonder. She was going to expand the wonder essay into a book. I want to set that aside for a moment. There's another project which we can tentatively call Remembrance of Earth, that she claimed she was working on. And I will just try to be kind of brief about this, but it does seem like that something like this project existed, and there's only a little bit of evidence of what it was that she planned it to be. And so there are a couple of possibilities. And I was getting this kind of comes from the symposium at Yale that I was at last month. So there's another literary scholar named Michelle Navickas who is writing a book about Rachel Carson right now, and her sense of what's going on with Remembrance of Earth was that it was going to be this sort of poetic, eclectic book. And she's found this folder in the archive that has a table of content, a handwritten table of contents, and some kind of poetic fragments about the natural world. And Rachel Carson does use the title Remembrance of Earth only in a letter to Dorothy Freeman. I can talk about her relationship. It's her kind of friend, kind of lover. And she says, "You're the only person who knows the title of this book. You're the only one who knows its true name." And there's some evidence that she had some experiences of sort of wonder or awe at the natural world that she planned to incorporate into this. The difficulty is that a lot of the contents of that folder are undated. And the latest references to this Remembrance of Earth project from the Dorothy Freeman correspondence is like 1956, 1950, or 1957, 1958, something like that. Sort of in the mid to late 50s, she mentions this. As far as I know, it doesn't really come up again. And my own interpretation is a little bit different from Michelle's, which is she agreed to write a book. Rachel Carson agreed to write a book for the Harper World Perspective series in like 1952. So she's supposedly working on this book for like 12 years, and there's never a draft of it. But it was originally going to be called The Origins of Life, and then later Carson writes to her editor that she wants it to be about life in relation to its environment. And even though there's never really any material for this book forthcoming, she keeps reassuring her editor, I'm working on it. I'm still having ideas for it. I'm so glad that I didn't try to write it sooner because I feel like I'm finally ready to write this book. And then, so there's a 1961 letter. I didn't put this on the slide either. She says, "In spite of the lack of visible progress, it continues to grow in my mind, and I feel it may be the most important of my books." And so, how did I fold this in? Yeah. So she then says in 1963 that she's going to give 4 lectures, and they're going to form the framework of the new book. She only lived long enough to deliver 2 of these lectures. One in 1962 called Of Man and the Stream of Time, and then the other one's in 1963 called The Pollution of Our Environment. So I won't get too much into this, but my interpretation of it is that she's really thinking about, well, how does time and history work in this context when the human ability to disrupt biological and physical processes in the world is getting so high. And so you kind of get human history in the wake of pesticides and in the wake of nuclear pollution, grading up against geological and evolutionary history. So this is a more kind of argumentative interpretation of what this late unfinished work might have been. And the difficulty with it is that there's evidence that she found this editor, Ruth Nanda Anshin, who was the series editor for World Perspectives, very stressful and very annoying. And so it's possible that she's not being entirely forthcoming in this correspondence, and she's kind of trying to hold her off by reassuring her that she's still working on this. To me, it seems a little bit stronger than this folder of undated fragments that Michelle has found, because it's later and there are more explicit statements, but it's also to a person who she had less of a close relationship with and trusted less than in the correspondence with Dorothy Freeman. And I will just briefly say that at this symposium, there's this woman, Wendy, there, who is married to Roger, who was Rachel Carson's nephew, who she then had to adopt after his mother died. And Wendy said, well, maybe it was just kind of a title that they were throwing around, and she didn't really have a coherent idea of what this project was going to be. So those are the three possibilities. There was this poetic eclectic work, that it was this kind of argumentative, I'm almost saying like theoretical, philosophical work, or maybe there was never really any such projects, and she was just trying to hold people off and keep them reassured in the last years of her life. Okay. We're doing okay. I'm going to close with just two long quotes, and then I'm curious what you all think. So this is the last paragraph of Under the Sea Wind. She says, and as the eels lay offshore in the March Sea, waiting for the time when they should enter the waters of the land, the sea too lay restless, awaiting the time when once more it should encroach upon the coastal plain and creep up the sides of the foothills and lap at the bases of the mountain ranges. As the waiting of the eels off the mouth of the bay was only an interlude in a long life filled with constant change, so the relation of sea to coast and mountain ranges was that of a moment in geological time. For once more, the mountains would be worn away by the endless erosion of water carried in silt to the sea, and once more all the coast would be water again, and the places of its cities and towns would belong to the sea. So, I won't say too much about this, but I've been thinking of this as this kind of vertiginous zoom out that she's doing. She's zooming out in space and she's zooming out in time in, I think, a very disorienting way that, again, if you think of her as this kind of middle American, middle class professional writing in the 40s, it's a sort of disturbing thing to think about of the seas of the Atlantic coast region being reclaimed by the ocean. And then the last one comes from a late letter to Dorothy Freeman. And at the time that she wrote this letter, Rachel Carson knew that she was dying from cancer, even if she wasn't saying that to very many people in her life. And they've just spent the morning on an island in Maine, and she's writing a sort of follow-up letter to this experience that she's had. She says, I shall remember the monarchs, that unhurried drift of one small winged form after another, each drawn by some invisible force. We talked a little about their life history. Did they return? We thought not. For most, this was the closing journey of their lives. But it occurred to me this afternoon, remembering that it had been a happy spectacle, that we had felt no sadness when we spoke of the fact that there would be no return. And rightly, for when any living thing has come to the end of its life cycle, we accept that end as natural. For the monarch butterfly, that cycle is measured in an unknown span of months, in a known span of months. For ourselves, the measure is something else, the span of which we cannot know. But the thought is the same. When that intangible cycle has run its course, it is a natural and not unhappy thing that a life comes to its end. That is what those brightly fluttering bits of life taught me this morning. I found a deep happiness in it. So, I hope, may you. And so that's where I'm going to end it. But, you know, again, maybe she's kind of trying to reassure her friend who is worried about her impending death. But I also sort of see it as her wrestling with her own place in this ecological worldview that she's been trying to lay out. This is the sort of most extreme example of it, is to face your own death with a kind of peace and reflectiveness about your own embeddedness in the cycling of matter and the wider ecological relations. But with that, I'm really curious what your thoughts and questions are. And I guess, Amy, you can just let us know when we've taken the time that you would like us to take. Does anyone have any thoughts or questions for me? Yeah.
I'm curious, which came first for you, ecology or literary interests?
Oh, yeah. I really come from the academic humanities and literary studies and theory, and I was not so plugged into environmental issues and ecology. But after I had graduated from college, I started getting, actually, there was a couple of things, but I read this William Cronin book, Nature's Metropolis, which is an environmental history of Chicago. And that kind of blew my mind. I hadn't really been thinking in those ways before. And I ended up doing a master's in environmental humanities at the University of Utah. And so I was doing literary studies, but I was also in a program with people who were sort of coming from different fields and doing different kinds of interdisciplinary work, all connected in some way to environmental issues. And I was living in Salt Lake, and so I really got to live in like a polluted place, you know, like a place that's kind of on the front lines of climate change in a way that I think it took a little bit longer, for me at least, to sort of see it happening here. And I also got to know some people who were sort of direct action, you know, climate activists and that kind of thing in Utah. And then the Rachel Carson stuff, I was really working on the literature of the American West, and that's where some of my other research comes from. But after I had started the PhD, the guy who's now my advisor suggested that I look into Rachel Carson. And so she's the most recent addition to my work and my research interests of the stuff that I'm working on. But I've really found since that it seems like there's a growing interest in her and an interest in reevaluating her. And as I was saying, there's a couple of good biographies, there's good stuff written about Silent Spring, but there's a trilogy of ocean books from before Silent Spring, and especially in literary studies, they're largely neglected, I think. Other thoughts, Stephen?
You know, you addressed this a little bit, but I'd like to hear you say more about it. I guess the question is, did she see herself as a literary figure, or was it in service to communicating the science or the concern or the philosophy? You know, how did she see that?
I really like that question. I think one thing that's true is she's not really part of like the New York literary world, right? She lives in DC, and then she has a summer house in Maine, and a lot of her connections, I think, are more in the conservation world, government, science and conservation advocacy, Audubon Society, those kind of folks. So she probably sees herself in a tradition of nature writing. And I think that one of the ploys of my research is like, what if we don't talk about nature writing as a separate stream of literary history? What if we kind of have to tell that story in dialogue with other things that are being written and the sort of main stem of American literary history? Because I think there is this sort of sometimes nature writing gets talked about in these kind of organic ways, as if it's a naturally developing, like plant-like kind of thing that's always moving us towards ecological consciousness and the recognition of unity. And I just don't feel very satisfied with that. So she definitely, at a certain point, she gets a nature writing award. And so then she says, I'm so happy to be following in the footsteps of Henry David Thoreau and John Burroughs and these folks. And the last thing I'll say about it is there's this thing that she says at an awards acceptance speech that I've thought about a lot, where she says something like, if there is poetry in my book about the sea, it's not because I put it there, but because basically, how could you write accurately about the sea and leave the poetry out? And so that's kind of the space, that's like the space that I'm trying to inhabit, you know, is there a way of being literary that's instrumental to getting us into the complexities of the natural world and like getting us closer to the natural world. So I think that she was pretty humble and she was working pretty hard in her own lane. I don't think that she would have talked herself up too much as like a literary writer. But I guess I'm also not really ready to say that it was like the conservation concerns came first and then she thought, okay, how do I translate this? They seem to be sort of interwoven from the beginning. Yeah, Mom.
Zach, who held Rachel Carson in that chair right there? What would be the one question that you would want to ask?
that's a good question too. I mean, for my own research, okay, actually, I think one of the things that is kind of nice about doing this work is that I'm working on people who are no longer alive, right? And so they can't speak up for themselves about how right or wrong I am. And I think that there is a kind of creative aspect of this work. You know, if it was just tracking down the exactly whatever happened, I don't think I would have a lot of patience for that. In terms of my research, the thing that's unanswered is, what were you trying to do with this unfinished work? Like, what were you lying to Ruth Nanda Anshin? Was the project you were telling Ruth Nanda Anshin about the same thing that you told Dorothy was Remembrance of Earth? That like feels like an actually rich, like empirical research question, although I don't know if there's enough evidence to ever definitively answer it. And then the last thing is, there's this kind of attempt now, because she was never married and really her only intimate relationships were with women. There's a body of research that's sort of writing about her as a queer writer. And my instinct is just that whatever she was, like the categories that we have available to us right now don't really capture it very well, however she understood herself. But she wouldn't want to talk about it, but I would be curious, like, how do you view your own like orientation and your relationships with these people? I don't think she ever talked about that, as far as I know. Yeah, Amy?
I was just curious if you feel like it could be all three of those things. Like, I feel like as a writer, one day it's going to be this, and
Yeah, I
6
know.
months later, and I'll find these old drafts, and I was like, oh, I totally forgot I was going to go that way with it, and I might have described it to
Yeah,
somebody in a totally different way, and they're like, are you still doing this? And I'm like, oh, I
maybe.
you know, like, and it's impossible to say what it was going to be, even in her mind, because she died. So, who
Yeah.
knows? You know, it's like, I don't know if there's any way that evidence can, like, I feel like it's kind of all three. You know?
I think you're probably right in some ways, but I think the significance for it, for me as someone who's doing research on her, is it kind of brings into focus this like imaginative,
Yeah.
fabulative, if that's a word, like part of the research process. And I think that's what was coming up in my conversations with Michelle, who's a more established scholar than I am, is like we both really want there to be a narrative around this thing, you know, but whatever I say about it is going to be partially my own reconstruction of the facts and like re-narration of the facts as I can find them in the archive.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
I'm just curious. I studied history, and I read a writer who was a writer and a historian and a feminist, and she kind of like did history different
Mm-hmm.
as a feminist project. Like, it was kind of like she's not going to write history the same way. Like, she felt like to really represent the lives of women, you have to write it differently. And I'm wondering if there's anything with Rachel Carson, like was she kind of like subverting the
Yes.
norms of scientific writing in a kind of way that she was like, you can't, like what you were saying about the poetry, like you can't really get to it through the kind of like orthodoxy of science, if that makes sense.
Yes, it makes me think of a number of different things. Because on the one hand, she does have this kind of poetic sensibility, but I think she's also extremely strategic about how she's going to come off and how, you know, the things that she has to say are going to land on her audience. So there's a sort of longer conversation we can have about Silent Spring and how that played out. But at the Yale symposium, someone asked a question that was like, was she a feminist? It was a little bit glib, I think, but and one of the other people who's also writing a book about Rachel Carson right now had a good answer, I thought, which is like, as a woman, and I think especially in this period of time, but like throughout history, the biographer Janice Nomura has written about like 19th century women in her other books, is that if you're gonna do something new and subversive, you have to do it in the most conservative and careful way possible. And that's kind of the sense that I get about Rachel Carson, is that she sort of recognized how disruptive some of her ideas about the environment and about pesticides were and how they were going to land on her audience. And so she had to play it in the most careful, tightly argued way, because she knew that no matter how careful and sort of conservative and practical seeming she was going to get attacked. Because, I mean, I guess I would just say that something like Silent Spring, and I think also the vision that she's articulating in Under the Sea, it really poses a challenge to the whole ideology of progress and development and economic expansion, which, you know, is entrenched and dominant now. But I think there were not as many people in the sort of mainstream middlebrow reading and writing world who were articulating things like that at that time. Yeah.
How did her life as a single woman change, or how was it affected by adopting her nephew?
I would first of all say I'm not the expert on that, and I think this is kind of something I was thinking about in response to Amy's question as well. That I don't know if I'm doing feminist history or something, but I think there's been a lot of emphasis on her her sort of biography and her as a moral person, and so I've been I've tried to know as much as I can, but I've tried to really take a view of her that's like her in disciplinary history, literary history, scientific history. It's a little bit like more distance from the nitty gritty of her life. And also, you're right, she was unmarried, but it's not like she was living by herself. Her niece, who was Roger's mother, I think was living with them for quite a while. She had persistent health issues, and then Rachel's mother was living with her up until her death, which is, I think, not that long before Roger came to be adopted by her. So I don't know exactly how her life changed, but I guess I was talking with Laurie Burns about this a couple days ago. In certain ways, like, Rachel Carson had to take on this masculine role within her nuclear family. So it doesn't really seem like she had intimate emotional or sexual relationships. She did have some friends who were men, but her most intimate relationships, as far as I can tell, were always with women. But from pretty early on, and I think it goes back to like her decision to leave graduate school, she really had to work to support her mom and to support, I think, some of her siblings and then her nieces and nephews, and including Roger. So I think she had enormous stress in her life, and she was juggling a lot of different things. And I'm sure she loved Roger, but I imagine it was hard for her. I think she was in her 50s already at the time, you know, and she's trying to write Silent Spring, and she's trying to write these other books. So she writes with a lot of affection about him, but what Laura and I were talking about is what a difference it makes, especially in this historical period, 40s, 50s, 60s, to have a wife if you're going to have like a professional writing career where you're out in the world and presenting things. And Rachel Carson just did not, other than her sort of aging mother, like, did not have a sort of wife figure to be facilitating her life. She kind of had to do all of it. Yeah.
Could you talk a bit more about the essay on wonder? I'm curious what that one's called.
Yeah. So it was published originally in Women's Home Companion in 1956. I can go back at least to the passage which has the title. It was called Help Your Child to Wonder. And then after her death, it was adapted into a book, an illustrated book, but she hadn't written any new text, really. So it's just the essay sort of spread across an entire book with a bunch of photos and stuff like that. And I found a PDF of it, of a scan from Women's Home Companion, and I've taught it a couple times to my like freshman writing students. And it's a cool essay, but it's also kind of cool to see it in the context. There's recipes, there's ads for different home products and these sort of 50s recipes that are in the margins around this essay. And what she I think I'm trying to. It's been a little while since I read it, but she's addressing parents who want to help their children learn about the natural world, and it kind of comes from this nature study tradition where she says you don't really need to know that much. The important thing is that you go out together and you be curious together and use your five senses and ask questions. And there's something, there's a line that's like, that it's better, I'm going to butcher it, but it's better to stoke curiosity rather than put a child on a diet of facts he is not ready to assimilate, or something like that. And so she envisioned expanding it into a book that would be oriented towards like children, I think, and parents, and expanding on this basic idea of how can parents guide their children to learn more about the natural world. And wonder is her kind of key for that, is cultivating this attitude of wonder. And then once you are curious, then you'll want to look up the facts that sort of support the things that you're observing out in the world. So it ended up not really being like a focus of my research. I came across a couple of table of contents in her archive where she was plotting out, like, I think there's a chapter on clouds, there's a chapter on birds, so those chapters would kind of take different aspects of the natural world and guide children in a little bit more detail, but she did not live long enough to turn it into a full-length book.
Do you think that she kind of lived through wonder, with wonder?
Yeah, I think that is her attitude toward the natural world that sort of starts quite early, and then everything, all the intellectual stuff and the writing is kind of laid on this foundation of this really passionate attachment to the natural world. And I think it's a pretty good argument. This is not like something that I came up with myself, that there's an article that I like that kind of helped me think about this, that calls the tone of Silent Spring cold prophetic rage. And I think, it's not just intellectual or sort of like strategic or pragmatic for her. I think she loves the natural world. She loves birds. I think she has a lot more patience than I do to sit outside, observe things, maybe more than a lot of us here, you know? So she just loves being outside and observing things. And the Wonder essay sort of starts with this anecdote about Roger. Roger is, I think, 4 at the time of her writing the essay, and she's talking about going out in the Maine woods after a rainstorm or during a rainstorm and observing together all the things that they find. And so she is trying to sort of share this wondering attitude with Roger, and that's how she frames this like address to the parents. Yeah.
So, just as sort of a follow-up question, this isn't really focused on the literary part, but was the nature study tradition, how widespread was that? I haven't heard too much about it, and it seems like it really influenced your question, but
I don't have a like really good answer for that.
yeah.
The person who was the kind of main promulgator of that, promoter of it, and articulator of it is this woman, Anna Botsford Comstock, and she had a book called The Handbook of Nature Study, which is kind of turn of the century, early 20th century, and she was at Cornell, I think, and so that was and she had maybe it was her husband or a couple collaborators at Cornell who were promoting this idea. So was it largely like a Northeast phenomena? Maybe. There's some history about it. I haven't gotten super deep into it. It's a little, again, it's ended up being a little bit outside the frame of the work that I do. But it's totally like there is a body of literature about it. You can get a PDF online, Hathi Trust or something, of the entire Handbook of Nature Study, and like look into those folks. So it's clear that she was exposed to it in Pennsylvania in the 1910s and 20s. Was it happening in California? Was it happening in Canada? I'm not totally sure. Yeah, Megan.
Did she, she died of cancer
Well, it's kind of tough because I think it seems to me, I mean, my understanding is it's really hard to trace it back and find, what particular factors or exposures might have led to this later in life. But she grew up in Pittsburgh in the 1910s and 20s when it was rapidly industrializing. And she writes about, like, when she went home, it was getting progressively more polluted in the area where she grew up. So I think she was exposed to some pretty heavy duty, pollutants early in her life. In terms of her cancer, my sense is also that she was living with chronic stress. She was always worried about money. Like I was saying, she's like managing her family. She's trying to be a literary writer. And she's dealing with heavier and heavier stuff. Another thing that I considered mentioning, although I don't have a ton to say about it, is she got interested in pesticide pollution in 1943. And there's she pitches to some magazine, like, that there are these red ant control projects happening in the South, in Alabama. She's really concerned about them. And no one wants to publish her talking about pesticides in the 40s. And so it really comes back around like 15 years later that she starts working on Silent Spring. So maybe also, she might have been exposed to some of that stuff. Well, also just living in the 50s, she was probably exposed to DDT and all those kinds of things. I think the thing that's tough about it is that the fact that she dies so soon after Silent Spring, there's this smear campaign against her by the chemical industry, and she's so associated with pesticides in the popular imagination that it really lends itself to this kind of martyrdom narrative, that she stood up to the industrial chemical companies and then she was killed by cancer because of, in brackets, because of the this industrial pollution. So I think it's true, probably, that industrial pollution in some kind of way, had something to do with her cancer.
She doesn't. Does she actually inquire? That's what I'm curious about. Is she looking at?
I think she's trying to stay alive. The other thing that's kind of crazy about the story is that the first doctor that I would need to like piece it together if I was going to trace it out, but the first doctor that realized she had cancer didn't tell her because she didn't have a husband to be told, and so she found out much later that it was cancer when it was quite advanced. So if that first doctor had been more forthcoming with her, she might have had a longer life. But I haven't come across anything that's explicitly like, oh, I'm trying to figure out where this came from. I think she had a lot of other health struggles aside from the cancer throughout that period of her life. Early 60s, I think. If actually, maybe late 50s. 57, 58. She wrote 4 books in that time.
That was like 1964?
64.
Okay.
I think it maybe is less than 2 years after Silent Spring was published. It's April of 64, I think is when she died.
What would you think she would say about her own legacy? Because we chalk it up to like DDT, pesticide.
Yeah.
What do you think she wanted to be remembered for?
Well, I think that's kind of, this has been kind of the gambit of some of my writing more recently, is how would we remember her if she'd been able to complete one of these books? Because there's this kind of story that leads inexorably towards Silent Spring, and it culminates there. And so retrospectively, everything she did before is the preparation for Silent Spring. Silent Spring allows her to have this monumental impact on history. Then she conveniently dies soon afterwards. And so it just seems to me that she was really surprised at how long it took her to write Silent Spring. And the evidence is that she wanted the next things that she was going to write were going to be turning back to the living world. After writing about their potential destruction from pesticides. She wanted to write this wonder book that was about like plugging children back into their relationship with nature. And she wanted to write what I've been calling her like ecological opus, although who knows, that would have been this kind of teasing out. It seems like she wanted to make some kind of big statement about life in relation to its environment. How does ecology work? What does an ecological way of thinking about the natural world reveal to us? So I think that she was really trying to be like a modern continuation of this nature writing tradition. And that it's some kind of accidents of history that lead her to be this representative of like the crusade against pesticides. I think she cared about it a lot. She clearly worked really hard on the book, but she didn't view that as the culmination in the way that it has become the culmination of her life's work in retrospect. Oh, Derek? Maybe the last question? Was that, or?
Maybe I'm trying to start a conspiracy. Are there records, like medical records, like
Derek's
did she really die of cancer? You know, was she tapping into something that maybe didn't?
I mean, I don't know that I'll endorse any alternate theories of the cause of her death, but because in some ways the chemical companies got her anyways, whether it was intentional or not. But I've read some of her correspondence, and especially when she became really well known, the stuff that people would write her is really weird. And so there are people, accusing her of being a communist operative for writing Silent Spring. And the Dr. Bronner's guy wrote to her, and all of the O's in his letters are hole punched through. Just just people said really weird stuff to her in there, and would just write to her, unsolicited. Good. Thank you all for being here.